We are very happy to have Dr. Wong with us today. And Matt is going to, do you know what, Matt? I'll just let you introduce him. And then, Dr. Wong, if there's anything that you want to add to that, please go ahead. So, Matt, we'll have some questions and then there'll be some time for questions and answers at the end. So just keep those in mind and you'll have a chance to ask those. So, Matt, thank you for.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. Well, I guess good morning where you are, Dr. Wong, and good afternoon for others. I was going to actually ask you to introduce yourself and start with even just a little bit of the question and go from there and ask if you can tell us about yourself a little bit and just what the Flourishing Congregation Institute is all about, which would probably allow us to get a sense of who you are and what's
Sure. Yes, I'm a Mac grad from 1989, 1990, and did my MDiv at Mac. Very formative years and experience being a student at Mac, and really cherished that experience because it really helped me kind of sort out in terms of vocational direction and identity. So I do thank Mac for that experience. After I graduated, I pastored a Chinese Alliance church in Toronto, and so spent about 10 years serving there. And so after that, Ambrose University asked me if I wanted to come and be on faculty, and I initially said no. Why would I do that? But they convinced me to come, and I've been here for almost 25 years, serving as professor of practical theology. And so that's sort of where my role is at Ambrose. Now, the Flourishing Congregations Institute started in 2016, and I was one of the originators. Basically, folks, we are an interdisciplinary and ecumenical research center housed at Ambrose. And one of the things I really enjoy is collaborating with other scholars and practitioners, and especially from diverse disciplines and theological traditions and institutions across Canadian regions. So that's a little bit about myself and a little bit about the Institute.
Great, thanks. It seems exciting. I'm very much looking forward to the next 45 minutes or so on what we can learn in the process. I'm just wondering if you might be able to offer a brief glimpse into some of the initial insights that you may have gleaned about what a flourishing congregation might actually look like, and how does this relate to your experiences within foundering or flourishing congregations?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Maybe I should preface that just a little bit about what we actually do at the Institute, and then I'll try to answer your question, Matt. Basically, what we do at the Institute is we gather and we curate and we share Canadian Christian church data. Okay, that's what we're really about, and that's sort of our bread and butter. To collect Canadian data, because what we're finding is that there's not a lot of Canadian data. I mean, we often look towards the US or to Europe or Australia for data. So that's the thing that we do. We do, I hope we do good theological reflection and provide some practical application of that data for Canadian churches. So in terms of practical application, we're doing, I guess, more these days. with helping practitioners, particularly, to interpret and begin to contextualize some of that data into their own congregational settings. So to answer your question about some of the initial insights, I don't know if you've had the opportunity to either read our book or look on to our website. And basically on our website, we have what I would call 11 constructs about what a flourishing congregation is. And that is based on some of the research that we've done and some of the literature that we kind of reviewed. And so basically three dimensions and 11 constructs. And again, if you want to take a quick look, but basically the three dimensions of flourishing. The first has to do with what we call internal constructs, with things like, congregational diversity and, is your congregation a hospitable place? Do you have an engaged laity? Is that discipleship happening there? So that's the first construct. The second construct or dimension, I should say, is outward. So things like evangelism and partnership and, is your congregation involved in the neighborhood? So that's basically the three for what we call the outward, and the inward dimension has four basic constructs. So, how does a congregation see its self-identity? What does leadership looks like? How do congregations innovate? And what do some of the structures and processes look like? So those are, maybe that's just to give you a brief background of the dimensions and the constructs. But specifically to your question, Matt, congregations I think commonly flourish in some areas, all right, and they flounder in others. Let me just put it that way. Plus, I would say denominations draw on theology in different ways. Let me put it that way, to really accentuate the ways that they believe, right? Flourishing is essential or flourishing isn't essential. So, for example, evangelicals, what would evangelicals do? For example, they would stress evangelism in ways, say, that mainline Protestants may not, okay? So in short, if you're flourishing or if you're floundering, I guess my point is what we've learned in some of the empirical data as we kind of look at it and theologize about it, really is fluid rather than this, that it's static. And really, at least in our research, we feel that there's no universal answer to a flourishing or floundering question. I guess the biggest thing is context matters a lot, and it matters greatly. So that's how I would kind of think about that, and I think some of our research kind of bears that out.
Great. So it's not an easy checklist for us to find.
No, because many of us know that context, right? Things you can't transplant paradigms or models. The context and locality makes a big difference.
One of the things we asked, or we suggested ahead of time, was for people to have read the "Are You Listening" paper.
Oh, great!
That they have a little bit. So
I hope you liked it. Was it okay?
I thought it was great. I'm sure if we did a straw poll that we would have uniformity on that. But regardless about that, one of the themes that that is highlighted in the paper is a little bit the tension between theory and practice. Some of in the churches that we're seeing. Based on your experience, what are some ways we might better integrate the two in sort of our preparing prospective church leaders?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And again, it's how do we connect theory and practice? And again, I think that's that's important. There's an importance to that. And to me, I kind of think, how do we facilitate these types of connections between theory and practice? And I think for me, what I've learned is I think it's by really creating these spaces of dialogue and community learning. Um, one place that I think we do that well, especially for, prospective church leaders in your own theological education, and I'll address it from that context, is really the field education and internships or practicums. I think that, there we see a lot of collegial interactions between the field and faculty. But I do think that we need to extend that in our practical theology courses and also in our biblical studies and systematic theology courses. Perhaps I'm preaching to the choir here in that way, and we need to get other folks in this conversation. But I think also in biblical studies and systematic theology courses as well, really to facilitate, their practical application, because faculty nurture students, right? And so they need to see, and I think students and budding, seminary students need to see how connections are made between theory and practice. I don't know if that answers your questions a little bit, Matt, there, but I think from a faculty perspective, perhaps I think a good starting point is the classroom, and really for professors to ask themselves, how do they go about designing their courses for student learning? And so I think that then touches on pedagogy and, the models of teaching and learning from that perspective. One of the things, the 5 things that I do here at Ambrose is I also have a cross appointment in our School of Education. And I also work with pre-service teachers who are, obtaining their initial Alberta teaching license. And so working with my colleagues in education, to me, that's such a joy because they get this connection and relationship with the courses that they teach and with the field. And they really do well in terms of scoping and sequencing courses. And so this interaction, I think, is a dialogue, and just hanging out with my education colleagues. This dialogue and this iterative process is very much iterative in nature. And I really appreciate this back and forth between the classroom teaching and learning and the field. And so a lot of our research, when we chatted with pastors, is that they talked very much about their field experiences and just helping them bridge, their academic learning and practical ministry experience. And I do think that we need to do that better in theology, in this theory and practice connection. So hopefully I've answered your question there, Matt.
Well, no, you did. One of my roles is field ed coordinator, so you're speaking to the choir for sure in that capacity.
Oh yeah.
Of the importance of that. But I'm wondering, did you, like, to pick up a little bit, you talking about pedagogy a little bit, is there some things that you've taken from interacting with those teachers, sort of that you've been able to integrate into sort of a more broadly a practical theology course that you found has been effective in sort of helping sort of that practitioner oriented curriculum stuff? Or I know that's a little bit off script from the question.
Not at all. One of the things, at least in terms of pedagogy, I just kind of think, well, let me put it this way, between direct instruction and say more of an inquiry-based type of teaching and learning. Let me put it in that context. Uh, um, you know, I just find when students come into my classroom, they bring a rich experience. And I think as instructors, we need to acknowledge that experience and that prior learning that they've had and utilize it. That really when we're together, and practical theology does this so well in that, we're not necessarily transmitting knowledge, but we're generating knowledge, right? And so I like that type of interaction with students. And if a lot of the classes that I teach now, I do a lot of flipped classroom stuff and really get student engaged with the content outside of class, and the interaction and conversations in the classroom is really the fun part for me, and helping to process those types of things. And so that's how I think that's in fact that's how I think that happens in pastoral ministry, right? Is that these rich conversations and dialogue that we have with one another and trying to figure out how to move forward. Like to me, pedagogically, um, uh, that's the best place to do it in terms of and some of the side effects. What I would say is the sense of community. And many of you know, if you're students here, these days, particularly in graduate theological education, there's not long gone are those days when we have full-time students. Most students, at least at our shop here at Ambrose, are part-time students. And so where else do you build community? One place is the classroom, where you can have the opportunity to build pedagogical community. And I think that's sort of where theological education needs to head towards, knowing that the part-time nature of our students, and that they have rich experiences and they come from different walks of life, and they don't come as clean slates. We just need to be able to acknowledge that.
Thank you. That is a great answer. I appreciate that, and I hope the others do as well. Let's move a little bit and talk about leadership development. Sort of the idea, leadership development, spiritual and professional, played an important role in the paper. What are the hallmarks of a good leader in a flourishing congregation, and sort of how do we measure a good leader? I asked this a little bit because defining leadership and what effective leadership seems to be complicated, and it's sort of hard necessarily to have measurables that are easy to score. So I'm just wondering, from that, like, what are the hallmarks of a good leader in light of what you've seen and your experience?
Yeah, I'll speak a little bit from experience, but also I'll speak from the data as well. And I'll answer that question with a metaphor, and maybe that's the best way to kind of approach this. The metaphor of a keychain. Let me use that. I don't know if you've heard of keychain leadership. It was coined some time ago, but basically, keystone leadership is about keys that provide physical access to a building. When you think about it, who's the most powerful person, say, in a school? It's the janitor. They have all the keys. And so I just think when I think about that with the whole idea of keys, access to the building, and metaphorically, I would say they have the ability to welcome people, right, or lock people out. So leaders empower those who, I think, hold the keys. And the more power one has, the more keys that leader possesses in a church context. And so key chain leaders, I think, are very much aware of the keys in their possession, and I think they are intentional. Okay, let me say that, intentional about entrusting and empowering all people or all generations really with their own set of keys. So really, a key chain leader doesn't hoard things, or they don't keep the keys, right? They don't lend their keys and then they expect something or they want them promptly returned. I think they're willing to make a set of keys and hand them over to leaders of all ages in the church, and be willing to go along for the ride. So let me turn to the data a little bit that we did. So one of the hallmarks of a good leadership that we found, so we did a national survey of over 250 churches, and just had over 9,100, so 9,100 responses, really across theological traditions and Canadian region, church sizes. And we asked them a number of questions. So we asked these churches who kind of self-identified as either growing churches, or they're staying the same, or they're declining. And so maybe I'll just point out 3 questions that we asked them in the national survey, and that might help in terms of your question, Matt. But we asked, so our pastors, do they take seriously the advice and ideas offered by attendees in our congregation? So that's one question that we asked. And though growing churches agreed or strongly agreed with this statement. 74% of our respondents responded either agreed or strongly agreed. And about 63% for those churches, that they kind of think that they're staying the same. And for declining churches, only about 50% agreed or strongly agreed with that statement. And then we also asked pastors, in your congregation, do they appear to delegate or share tasks with others? All right. And those who were in growing or flourishing congregations, 87% agreed or strongly agreed with that statement, whereas about 80% agreed or strongly agreed that those congregations, in terms of flourishing, they're about the same, and declining congregations, about 69%. Agreed or strongly agreed that they delegate or share tasks with others. And then, which I find some of these numbers quite telling. And then the last one that we asked is in terms of developing new leaders, like in terms of developing lay leaders. Is that an ongoing thing in the congregation? And those who were growing congregations, 70% agreed or strongly agreed with that statement. Those who stayed the same, only 56% agreed or strongly agreed. And then the declining churches, 42% said that they agreed or disagreed, or I should say agree or strongly agreed with that statement. And so I just found that to be just really interesting about in terms of do pastoral leadership, do they listen well? And secondly, do they delegate and equip the saints for ministry? And thirdly, are they developing new leaders of all ages, from young and old, and anywhere in between? is that ongoing in the congregation? And so that's how I kind of see, you know, some measures, perhaps, Matt, of what good leadership is all about. So the whole idea of teaching, I think, is really important.
Great. Thanks. I've made some notes on that, so that's good. I just have one more specific question, and then I think we can allow a little bit more time to dialogue.
Sure.
But I would, reflecting on your experience as a former active student, which is actually the title, like, seems to be a little bit of a context thing. My brother graduated in mid 2000s, so he taught me it was MacDiv. But since
Yeah.
I started DPT here, I've been told it's MDC. But I
Yeah.
see that you call it MacDiv, so we have this contextualization of the title that we're wrestling with.
Yeah.
But regardless of that, but as many of us are fledgling practical theologians or fledgling practitioners or practitioners with various experience in various ways. I'm just wondering if you might give us one thing that you'd really want us to reflect on, that you might be integral for how we might shape a more flourishing future in sort of our ecclesial context. Is there
Yeah.
something, one specific thing that you'd say, here, hold on to this?
Well, I just kind of think in terms of Christianity and how we kind of interact with culture and how our congregations interact with culture. I think about the diversity of congregations in Canada, particularly. We know that immigration is very much highlighted, and the need, for immigration in all various sectors in terms of jobs and so on and so forth, right? So just the various types of diversities are very important to me in terms of reflecting our thoughts on that. And we know oftentimes that immigrants that are coming to Canada, if they're religious, they're usually much more religiously conservative and socially more conservative as well. And so I think, how do we go about welcoming and how do we integrate them into our congregations? Um, some of the work that Bibby has done with Catholics, particularly in Canada. I mean, he sees more of a sort of a polarization that's happening, but basically for Catholics, immigration has saved their bacon basically here in Canada, statistically speaking, right? And so dealing with ethnic diversity, but also I think also gender diversity as well. And how do we welcome gender and sexual diversity that are happening in our congregations, very much so. And what does that kind of look like? I think especially for those who are more conservative Protestants. I'm not sure how many conservative Protestants are here, but trying to kind of figure that out, both theologically and how does that kind of work out, and what dispositions that we take um, uh, in our congregations, and how do we go about discipling and educating folks in terms of diversity. So that's one thing that I think I know that we need to do a lot more work on that in terms of what does flourishing kind of look like in those kind of various either ethnic contexts or multi-ethnic contexts, because that's just the nature of Canada.
Well, great. That is another answer worth pondering and reflecting on for us. I want to specifically thank you from myself for engaging in your questions. branching the questions and the thoughts. And I think if there's conversation that happens beyond me, I guess we can open the floor up for that and see where it goes from there. Unless you have anything specific you wanted to say, in general, to get off your chest.
No, I'm perfectly fine. Thanks for asking the questions.
Hi, Dr. Wong. I would love to ask, and this is about one of the themes that comes out in the Are You Listening paper, but this whole idea of a spiritual formation of seminary students, and this is one of the things that the people on the ground, the pastoral leaders, wish that the educational institutions would address. I would love just to hear you talk about that a little bit, and your thoughts on how do we do that in a way that practically works, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just I mean, it feels like every week there's like another story of a lack of spiritual formation in ministry leader's life. So I think we all know that this is important, but how do we address it well?
Yeah. I mean, that's a good question, Elizabeth. I think one of the findings from the article is just that you're right on spiritual formation of students. I don't know if you read Dan Alshire's recent book on the professions. I think that's the title of it. Just went through that lately. Actually, I was reading that that with Mark Buchanan, one of my other colleagues, and we're just kind of having some conversations around that. But basically, what Alshire is saying is that we're moving away from this professional model of theological education to that of formation of the whole person. That addresses, moral maturity, spiritual maturity, and relational integrity. So let me just preface that before I get to your question, Elizabeth. But I also find, if you read Willie Jennings' book, that was very helpful too. That explains, after whiteness. I don't know if you've had a chance to read that. Two books that I would recommend that you read. And he explains how theological education has formed students into really this idealized white man that is competent, self-contained, self-assured, master and ruler. Is that okay to say here? Can I say that here? Yeah, that's okay. I know I know I can kind of see my audience. You're mainly white, so that's okay to say, sort of.
But it is gender diverse, right?
Yes, very much so. So I find these books very helpful about the conversation, and so I think there's that shift, Elizabeth, that I'm finding in theological education, where we're thinking more about formation and taking that much more seriously. The ATS standards, actually, which all theological seminaries here in North America, if they're part of ATS, is part of. And I was part of the redevelopment committee of the standards. And so we really had to push around spiritual formation of students, especially from some of our other colleagues from, say, more those schools where, say, Willie Jennings teach. But really having to push, the whole idea and the importance of spiritual formation and what that kind of looks like, because ATS and our seminars are getting those types of feedbacks, right? That we're producing students in this professional way, but and they're good in theology, and good in terms of exegeting a passage, which to me are all important things to do and to know and skills to have. But also then how about inwardly, and how about their own spirituality and formation? Again, one of the things that I'm doing here at the seminary is that again, with my colleague Mark Buchanan, we're working on part of a grant about seminary, how seminarians are formed, but also some of the other work that we're doing with character and spiritual formation of our seminary students. So that's another grant that we've been working on. And I don't think, I mean, what we've done is that we've done this longitudinal study and over the last 3 to 4 years, actually. And we surveyed actually our students at the end, at the end of each of the semesters in the fall, winter, and springtime. So we kind of followed them for about 4 years. And just basically, I mean, found out a little bit more about their spiritual life and their connection to God, and this what we call God attachment, so to speak, in the literature. And what we found is that connection with God, at least in some of the mean scores that we kind of did, they didn't change significantly over time on a lot of the measures that we've asked them to kind of fill out, like God's presence, God's presence in your life, or do you feel God's love directly? Or we asked them about how does God help you in your daily activities, and how do you go about feeling God's love through others? So what we found is that when seminary students on most days or frequently have this stable connection with God, it really helps them cope with everyday experiences. Like, that's not rocket scientists. That's natural, but now I got empirical data to kind of measure, right? And so I just found that to be just really interesting. And I think a lot of our practitioners have been telling us that, right? But we haven't been listening very well oftentimes. And so,
it's a good example of kind of hearing from the field, from the practice, about this is what we need, and now it's got to go the other way of responding to that.
Yeah.
There was a study that I was looking at from the UK about how doctoral students were being followed by their supervisor, a psychologist, and a spiritual director. And so they were just saying kind of that holistic care helped them weave what they were learning, their personal life, their past, kind of all those together. Like, it sounded like, oh, that's probably great spiritual formation happening.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Could I just springboard on Elizabeth's question?
Oh, please. Yeah.
Yeah. So Arch, just going back to the issue of formation, one of the interesting things that I noted in the paper was the seeming dichotomy between Catholic and Protestant practice around formation. And it seemed to me that like Catholic respondents were indicating that their formative activities seem to be much more formalized.
Yes.
As opposed to, do you have a sense in terms of thinking about education in this direction, if that's a better way to go? Are the Catholics doing it better, or in
some ways I think it's a better way to go, but it's not a practical way to go, at least for conservative Protestants. And so, I mean, those are some of the conversations that I have with Mark Buchanan and Rick Strangway, who also is our field ed person, and we talk a lot about this. in terms of, how do we get those types of formation? It is very formalized, and, spiritual directors and also accountability, especially around, because they have to go through, I don't know if you, I noted in the article the particular manual that they use actually in Catholic formation. And these days they take it much more seriously because around sexual abuse allegations, right? Around that. But the funny thing is, some of the work that I've read around that is that the sexual abuse, I think I'm quoting this right or stating this right, before the rigorous program of spiritual formation, those who were sexual abusers were prior to that. Okay, generally speaking, once these programs have been implemented, from this read is that at least their formation when they're dealing with not just spiritual but also sexual issues and so on and so forth, the sexual abusers were not necessarily from that group of subsequent people who've gone through priestly formation. So I just found that to be kind of interesting in terms of intentionality and really kind of thinking about it. Because in the conservative Protestant context, we don't have those types of things just because it takes too long, because we need to get people out there and we need pastoral leaders right now, particularly those who are much more missional minded in that way. It's sort of spiritual formation on the go sometimes. So I don't know if I answered your question, if it's better, but I think it's much more thoughtful and intentional. And but with like any system, you could go through the system and you still have your bad apples. But I think the name of the game is trying to minimalize that.
Just before we jump, I see a couple hands. I'm wondering if you could remind us the two authors you mentioned, William James Jennings and who was the first?
Oh, Dan Elshire.
Dan Elshire?
Yeah, he used to be the executive director of ATS.
Okay. I was asking a couple of people, wanted to make sure we get them. So anyway, Sean, why don't you go next?
Thanks, Matt, and thank you, Arch, for being here with us today. I have a ton of questions, so I'm going to have to limit myself.
Oh no!
There's just so much to think about, and I've been thinking, maybe I'll try to put some of the questions together. So I'm teaching adjunct at Carey Theological College, which is the online seminary based out of Vancouver.
Yeah.
And so you're talking about pedagogical community got me really interested, because I think that community will look different necessarily online versus in person.
Right.
And especially part-time, because if you're part-time in person, you can at least spend some time after a class sort of hanging out and having conversations. Part-time online, class ends, you close your computer and you're done. Yeah. And there's no real sense of community building in that regard. So I'm wondering, this might be a two-part question, so I'll ask the first part, I'll have to return to the second if that's okay. What kind of strategies have you seen that have worked for building community through digital means rather than just the sort of in person?
Yeah. One of the things that I've done in theology, but also more so in education, because I mentioned I'm cross-appointed in education as well, is creating some spaces outside of the classroom where students can gather. So, for example, on a Saturday morning, I'll gather them and say, whoever wants to come, you're not obliged to come, but if you have questions about what we've talked about the course, or things that we need to kind of work through, those are the spaces I think that I try to create to have a conversation with them and get to know them. And oftentimes, that may go offline, and they want to kind of speak to me on some maybe personal issues. But that's sort of the context. I mean, that happens in person too. Like oftentimes, I'm doing faculty advising with students, and then they want to shift to personal. And when I first started off doing this, I thought, that's not part of my job description. But then I thought, yeah, it actually is. So just a kind of, and some of the stories that they bring, and I'm not there really to solve their issues. Sometimes I do, but I'm there really to try to listen well to them and to kind of be a presence for them. And pedagogical presence online, yeah, that to me is interesting, trying to kind of figure that out, particularly when I have a blended classroom. Where I'm teaching one class right now. I mean, half of my students are in person, and the other half are online. And how do I kind of create a community with them? One of the things I basically do is before, and maybe Susan will know this. I start every class with prayer. And I spent about 15 to 20 minutes praying with students. And as the semester kind of progresses, it just gets more intimate. I've seen some of my colleagues also put on a prayer time in their LMS, whatever, if you use Moodle or Canvas or whatever, a time. And I seen them do that, and the results are mixed. They get hit and miss. It's like some semesters are great and some semesters are not so great. Those are some of the strategies that they've used. So yeah, it's funny when you kind of have that time to pray. It does build a sense of community, I find. And don't let the online modality be sort of a scary thing that like can you really know someone? And my answer would be yeah, actually sometimes better. One story is I had students like they took a class with me in person, and then they took a class with me online. But I guess what I'm trying to say there is in online, they found out so much about the other student that they kind of knew them when we got into the in-person. In that with the in-person part, if they were totally in person, they probably would have not known about who that person was. And who that person is. So really the online facilitate. I mean, there's some sense about online that that kind of removes a little bit that fear factor. I don't know. Maybe that's too strong of a term, but it also works the other way around too, right? You can keep very shut down your computer and off you go, right? Is that as well? So those are some of the strategies that I kind of have practiced and have seen. Some of them have worked well and some of them don't. But don't be afraid to try different things.
That's great. Thank you. I have another question about the role of the church, but maybe I'll plant the seed, and if we have time, we can return to it, because I know Deborah's waiting to ask a question, so I'll hand it off to her.
Oh, you want me to start now? Okay. Thank you so much for all of your research and for your writing. I'll change gears a little bit right now. I have a short question and then a longer one. And feel free to leave some of it unanswered if you want to. My first question is, what finally convinced you to join Ambrose when you were so reluctant to in the beginning? And then my longer one is, by practitioners, do you mean only pastors? What about theologically trained artists hired by churches to be part of the leadership team, or a mobile paid ministry of artist scholar 1-year residencies to engage leadership and congregants in practices separately or together? There's a well-known artist, collagist, printmaker who created community by doing community-based art making.
Yeah.
And that's Robert Rauschenberg.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would consider all those as pastoral leaders or leaders of some sorts. And so I use leader in a very broad sense, Deborah. And in our
The issue is in the hiring.
yeah. So I guess when I'm thinking about our survey work with people, I mean, we've identified as much as we can those various types of roles, and they are quite complex. When you said that, I also think about chaplaincy, right? Chaplains, for example, are another. So we call them pastoral leaders or leaders of the congregation. So to me, how they kind of check the box off is we can do a lot more granular work with that. And to me, particularly if you talk about the arts, they do bring a richness, I think, to congregational life. And so just wanting to say that it is very broad. And when they kind of interpret that, we just ask them to kind of interpret the ways in their particular contexts.
Well, I think that one issue for theologically trained artists can be a place to practice. And so my question surrounds like it's different than chaplains who are hired by hospitals, etc.
Sure.
But theologically trained artists, for them to be hired by churches themselves, is that a possibility that you look into?
Yeah, we haven't looked into it per se. We did get some responses, I'm thinking more in terms of not necessarily artists, but in say congregations. Oftentimes they come or they're kind of expressed in terms of say worship leaders or worship pastors, and that's not necessarily around. That's more around music than anything else.
That's always been the way it's been done, though.
It has.
It's always been a hired position.
That's right. So at least in our work, we haven't kind of dealt specifically, say, with those who are trained, theologically, artists in that sense. So it's probably something that would be kind of interesting to kind of look into. I mean, what's your thoughts on some of that stuff?
Well, I've been hired to do a 9-month artist scholar residency at a church here, and it's going very well. I gave a 6-part Zoom, some Zoom sessions in contemporary midrash writing. And I'm going to be I presented a paper, I'm going to be preaching a sermon, I'm going to be giving a devotional with a collage workshop.
Yeah.
I'm going to be facilitating poetry writing. And life writing, and a bunch of other things over the 9 months.
Yeah.
And it seems to be enlivening both the the leadership and the congregation.
Yeah.
and give them a different angle rather than, there don't seem to be very many people involved in direct Bible study.
Yeah.
So this is another way to get them into the Word, etc.,
Sure.
and in spiritual formation.
Yeah, I don't know why we don't do that more, Deborah. Because I find that enriching too, especially, I mean, in my own congregation that I belong to, where we've had say liturgical dance, particularly an expression in say, for example, in our worship services in our liturgy. I just find that to be very enriching, and what I hear from congregants is how meaningful it is to them, but also just the very practical question is, how come we don't do this more? It's sort of
Well, I had to
some of
knock on
their
doors. There's
responses,
no
right?
opening for it already. So
Yeah.
maybe there was an open door.
Yeah. So yeah, so I'm not sure what the some of the issues is around that. And it's probably our framing of what we think about pastoral leadership and what does pastor look like and so on and so forth. I think your point is well taken. Maybe that needs to be a lot more broad in that sense.
Yeah, good. Thank you, Deborah, for that question, and thank you, Arch, for the response. And I know that there's a few more questions out there, so I feel bad of bringing this to an end, but but I do want to honor our time. So sorry to those who did not get to ask their questions. Lee, did you just want to have a final word, or?
No, not necessarily, except to say thank you, Arch. And boy,
Yeah.
yeah, great provocative. I feel like I didn't put my hand up or anything because but I have lots of questions, Arch. But all in from a positive place of just wanting to explore your work further. So I think this has been a full session and really rich and a good time together. So yeah, but we have to leave it at that, I think, at this point. Yeah, but thanks to Arch and thanks to everyone for joining us today. Yeah, back to you, Elizabeth.